Welcome to another episode of the All Things Endurance podcast. I'm so excited for our guest today, Corrine Malcolm. Corrine and I have known each other for a little while. She was a contributor to some of our certifications. And Corinne's specialty is environmental physiology, something that, most of us, we experience on a daily basis, but don't know that much about. So Corrine, welcome, and I look forward to chatting with you.
Yeah, I'm so happy to be here. I was thinking, as you said that, we'll experience the environment every single day to different extremes. But it's some of us have spent a little bit more time intentionally being put in those situations than others.
For sure. And, it's funny, when we were going through the certification process to develop that section, it occurred to me that, there's so many areas out there that there's a lot of misnomers, a lot of misstood under information. And I think maybe because environmental physiology isn't really high up there on the awareness chart as far as how to deal with certain things, that maybe it might be one of the areas where there's the most incorrect information. So I think this podcast will be really helpful for a lot of people.
Yeah, I hope so. And I think we've been fortunate that we've been living within probably a decade of really good kind of sports science with some really, really hot Olympics driving a lot of that research. So I feel like as of maybe, in the 90s, right, or the early 2000s, some of that those misnomers or misinformation might have been more prevalent, but I feel like we're living in a golden age for environmental physiology.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. So before we get started into the meat of it, maybe you could give us a little bit of background with your education, your sport background, and also just how you got interested in environmental physiology.
Yeah, so I have been studying exercise science and exercise physiology for forever, it feels like, as a cross-country skier, growing up in the Midwest, falling in love with the nerdiest sport probably on the planet. Like, I've been wearing a heart rate monitor since I was 13 or 14. I've been undergoing graded exercise tests, metabolic cart, VO2 max, lactate threshold tests since I was 13 or 14, which is not the norm, I think, in most places. But when it comes to Nordic skiing and trying to Nordic ski at a high level, that is all too familiar. Fast forward to going to Montana State University, where I walked into the movement science lab like before school even started, like the week before school started. And I wanted to find this guy, Dan Heil, who has been a professor at Montana State for a long time, working specifically with the Nordic skiers. And I said, hey, I want to be a physiologist. I want to, at that time, and wanted to work with high performance athletes, wanted to work, within kind of an applied sports context. And he was like, yeah, we're doing VO2 max tests on the Bridger Ski Foundation, kind of post collegiate, Olympic development athletes this week. You can come help out with whatever you want. And so I just from day zero of undergrad starting, I was in the movement science lab, ended up leaving school, pursuing biathlon full-time. So skiing and shooting, met a bunch of really cool mentors during that time, including Randy Wilbur, who was a US Olympic Committee physiologist, based out of Colorado Springs for a long time. His specialty was altitude and then exercise-induced bronchoconstriction or exercise asthma, something that I did a lot of research on during my undergrad degree. And Randy kind of reemerges in my personal journey as an athlete and a researcher for a long time as well. Ended up coming back to school, graduating, and then headed off to Simon Fraser University to work in a altitude and heat and cold lab. So kind of an environmental science, environmental physiology lab up there, with actually the design to do research on, ideally at that time, firefighters, like wildland firefighters. I really wanted to study smoke exposure in those populations. Ultimately did not do that for thesis work, but spent a lot of time in various climactic chambers testing garments, testing thermal tolerance. Actually, one of the PhD students that I was with defends this week that we're recording. So I'm going to watch his defense virtually.
Cool.
He did thermal tolerance work in patients with spinal cord injuries. So it's just there's wide ranging things going on there, but we did a lot of thermal tolerance work, which is essentially making people really, really hot, raising their core body temperature, and then having them do exercise tasks or mental cognitive tasks and looking for changes. So it was a wild experience and learned a lot during that process, but also learned that I love science communication, kind of in that foreground there, and have since been working in the science communication space, doing a lot of writing and editing work for various publications, including, as we mentioned, for the certification for ultra endurance coaches.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Now, you were also a professional ultra runner, correct?
Yeah. So I still run professionally for Adidas Terrex. So a global based brand, but probably more popular in Europe. The outdoor line of the brand, there's like boxes of shoes behind me as we speak. But yeah, so I still run professionally. Have been dealing with injury for the last couple of years, kind of getting back in the saddle. It really feels like this season in a big way. So I've been doing a lot of sports commentary for ultra running over the last 2 years, doing commentary for the UTMB World Series, along with like races like Western States or Broken Arrow in the Western US. So I'm actually headed to Europe here shortly to do commentary for UTMB. So if you want to, if my voice is familiar, it's probably because you've watched 40 hours of me talking about our favorite runners.
Oh, that's awesome. It's funny, as a side note, I know a few people that also do announcing. They said they're also athletes, and they said it's funny when you get on the other side of the microphone. They said it's equally, if not more, exhausting.
Oh,
and it's so challenging, and they had no idea what they were getting themselves into. They're like, oh, how hard can it be? I'll just talk about running and who's crossing the finish line. And they're like, it is so hard.
Yeah, it's hard. I think some of us like probably have a natural predilection for it. My brain remembers, like, I can't remember the periodic table, but I like can remember what, Esther Chillag ran for a time at Worlds in Thailand, 18 months ago. So it's just like none of that makes sense, but it makes sense enough that it's easy for me to like fall into a pattern with another good co-host and talk for 20 hours, and all of a sudden the race is over. It's like
that's incredible.
Time warps in a big way.
Yeah, that's so cool. That's so cool. I'm sure some of the listeners most certainly know your voice then. So before we get in again to sort of the key or the granular aspects of environmental physiology, what are some of the key areas that are influenced when it comes to environmental physiology?
Yeah, so there's definitely different sectors of it. A lot of the work is done in heat because there isn't a lot of cold adaptation, but technically it's going to be things like heat, cold, humidity is studied sometimes, not necessarily mechanistically, but to set up realistic situations, as well as altitude. And then pollution actually is kind of a newer area of research within the environmental physiology space. So one of my kind of graduate mentors, Michael Cole, who I'd hoped to work with, but was on sabbatical when I was coming into grad school. He was a high altitude researcher who is now almost solely focuses on pollution. So if you've read any good things or listened to any good things by someone talking about like running in air pollution, it might be Michael Cole. He's a researcher at UBC and a physician over there and up in Vancouver, and is brilliant. Really, really awesome scientist, awesome physician. But yeah, so that also is encompassed in it. And then other things that are, it's not just performance and health metrics, but it's also like material science. So we're looking at how garments impact thermoregulation. How do they cool you down? How do they heat you up? How effective are they? That can be, working with a big corporate partner. I did work at Lululemon when I was up in Vancouver, for example, in their white space lab, helping develop a jacket. But it also is like doing safety testing for companies that develop things like emergency. They've got a very specific name. They're like it's beyond a personal flotation device, but they're used on big ships essentially. And it's like the ship is going down, or there's a storm. It's a personal rescue device essentially. And it's basically a giant inflatable looking spacesuit. And so our lab was responsible for testing those for certain companies as well. So we'd fill up a giant pool with, I think the average water temperature had to be like between 33 and 35 degrees Fahrenheit, basically just at freezing essentially. And we'd have volunteers in suits for 12 to 48 hours, monitoring core body temperature, monitoring temperature at their digits, so toes and fingers, etc. So yeah, it's really broad, but it's generally going to like be influenced by heat, cold, altitude, and now pollution, kind of as like the four main categories. Anything that fits under there will fall into environmental physiology.
Got it. Well, that's important work. The whole ship.
Yeah,
thing.
it's kind of a weird project.
Yeah, that's pretty wild. That is pretty wild. So maybe let's start talking about heat, because I think that's one of the things that people are, oftentimes the most sort of aware about and
Mhm.
want the most information about. So I guess maybe to start off that conversation, what is the correct way to acclimate to heat? And I guess conversely, what are some incorrect ways to acclimate to heat? I always think back to the Rocky movies, right? Where he puts on like 10 sweatshirts and runs around, the art museum in Philly a trillion times
Yep.
to lose weight. I'm assuming that's probably not advised, but I will let
Yeah.
you take it from here.
We're not going to be high school and college wrestlers trying to make weight. That
Put
is
on the
not our
garbage
goal.
bag.
Yeah, the old garbage bag running on a treadmill type of thing is not our goal. So yeah, so acclimation kind of has two categories. There's acclimatization in the natural environment and then acclimation in an artificial environment.
Hmm.
Again, we do this because humans are inherently inefficient, right? When we exercise, we produce a lot of heat. They're very fancy names for like how we're categorized as a species based on what kind of heat we produce, and how we dissipate it. And so we produce a lot of heat. So we have to adapt to that over time so that we don't do things like have a constantly super high core body temperature. That's not ideal for us, right? We humans like to work within a very narrow margin of core body temperature. That's so that like our proteins don't denature, all that kind of stuff, right? Like we don't want that. You've had a fever before. Our body doesn't like that state.
Yeah.
So there's a number of ways that are effective, which is important to state that there are lots of things that are effective, but as a physiologist and as a coach and as a practitioner, the way we're thinking about it is what is the smallest dose possible, and how are we smallest as possible to get the response we want is kind of the first key piece. And then the other factor to be thinking about is one, how does my athlete respond to this? I.e., like maybe it really takes a lot out of them and you got to modify it from there. Um, the other factor though is like, is this disrupting training as well, right?
Mhm.
Like you've got to put this during a training block somewhere, and how disruptive is adding this stressor. So we want the smallest dose possible to elicit the result. We don't want to be disruptive. We want it to be effective for the individual athlete. And then the other thing too that we'll talk about maybe a little bit more is like what's available to you, right? Like
Mhm.
not all these options are available to everyone. And that's important that, they all work, but they all work to it's not that they work to different degrees, but it's that some of them are more invasive than others. And some of them are more
Got it.
time consuming than others. And some of them are going to impact training or training quality more than others. So, the most obvious one is you're exercising in your naturally hot environment, i.e., it's a heat wave this week for most of the country
Yeah.
while we're recording. It's 90 plus. I did not run this morning. I'm going to get to go for an afternoon jog later in 90 plus degrees. That is natural heat exposure. Having that regular daily heat exposure, your body's going to acclimate to over time. Our bodies are really smart. They will make adjustments. The other types of things are going to be more like passive heating. And so passive heating is where you're not actively exercising to do the thing. That's going to be our dry saunas, our steam rooms or wet saunas, and our hot baths. So those are all three of those are types of passive heating, i.e., you're not exercising in that environment. And we can talk more about like nitty gritty specifics there, but it's going to be like getting into a sauna post exercise, getting into a hot tub post exercise, etc. It's passive. And those are generally done ideally post exercise, which once again, like we can get nitty gritty as we want in a little bit. And then the other category are going to be things like contrived heat exercise. So that's going to be wearing a lot of layers, or overdressing is what it's oftentimes
Okay.
called. So that could be inside or outside, right? That could be
Okay.
maybe you're in your laundry room. I know athletes that do this. They are in their laundry room or in their bathroom. They've created a hot, humid environment, and they've got no fan on, and they're wearing a lot of clothes. That's overdressing inside. Same thing goes for outside. We've got athletes prepping for Western States or Badwater every year who have three sweatshirts on and a down jacket and a raincoat, and they're going out for their run. And then
Okay.
the last bit of that is like um, a controlled uh, heat environment, which is going to be like working in a climactic chamber. We see
Okay.
this a lot with like British athletes. There's a bunch of good research labs over there that have heat chambers. So I've got athletes every year who are doing Marathon des Sables, a big stage race in the desert in Morocco. The Brits love this race. Every single year, I work with someone who lives in London who is going to do a number of sessions in a heat chamber. Those are super controlled sessions. They're running in their running kit. They're wearing a heart rate monitor. They're measuring core body temperature actively. That can also be used for heat acclimation. But again, like you're going to a chamber to do that. So you can kind of, again, it's going to be like exercising in a natural environment, passive heating post exercise. And then that third category is kind of like contrived heat environment, either by overdressing or going to a climactic chamber. And you can kind of already start to see, if you're thinking about like minimum dose, most disruptive to training, if the gears are turning at home, you're thinking like, oh, what might be the most disruptive? What might take an athlete out of their general patterns? What might be, they're all effective. At the end of the day, they're all effective. That's important to note. But some of them are not going to be as practical. Some of them are going to be not as easy to get in your speed session, your quality long run, your easy endurance run, whatever it is. You've got this disruptive thing happening in your training plan. And that's why, you know, if we're going to say right now, bullet points, like what is the most effective? If we can recommend to an athlete right away or to a coach, we're going to automatically prioritize dry sauna, hot bath, kind of wet sauna, overdressing are kind of how we are going to categorize it. And that's just like, those we know work. We know you can like get a small dose and make it really effective. And we know that when done strategically, you can still go about your training in a relatively normal manner because you're not doing anything weird while you're out exercising before you're going to the gym or going home to get into that hot environment, be it a hot tub or a sauna, et cetera.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, that's great information. I think a lot of people probably, like you said, are aware of, you know, maybe they don't practice it, but they're aware of those things, but they're just not, the whole minimal dose for the maximum response, I think, is so key. So are there, in your history of working with athletes and maybe also, you know, doing a lot of lab work, are there any common mistakes that you see athletes making when it comes to the heat?
Yeah, I think the biggest one and the most notable one is that there's this idea that more is better. Okay. So say, you know, I tell you that, you know, 10 days of sauna, that's all you need. Maybe two rounds of that, just so that you get used to how it feels, et cetera, over a 6-week period. They're going to say, oh, but what about 20 sessions or 40 sessions? What about more than one session a day? Oh, you want me in the sauna for 20 minutes to 30 minutes? What about if I'm in there for 40 minutes or 60 minutes, et cetera? Like more is not better. And I see that in a lot of athletes, and this idea that like, if it's not hard enough, it's not working. If it's not painful enough, it's not effective. If it's not, if I can fit in more, I should do it. And it's like, I have an athlete who's training for a big FKT attempt right now. And he recently was like, oh, I'm recognizing that maybe I don't have to be insane. Like I can like just focus on being fit and like healthy and like doing the work without it having to be the hardest thing possible every single day. And that's like, that's important. And the same thing goes for heat acclimation. We know what an effective dose is. More is not better.
Yeah. And I'm guessing the same athletes that, you know, you say, okay, go out and run 20 miles and they go out and do 40, they're likely the same sort of mentality that'll try to push the 20-minute sauna to 40 minutes. And that sort of, more is better, no pain, no gain, that whole philosophy.
Yeah, they're coming out of the hot tub or the sauna just like absolute, you know, ghosts, unable to function type of thing. And that's not what we want. Like, yes, it is a stressor. Yes, I know that the first couple of times I sauna every year for a sauna, like a heat protocol, like I'm like, oh, like I come out a little bit distraught, but it like you adapt pretty quickly, and it shouldn't be. The goal isn't to like have you destroyed every single day.
Right. And I'm guessing like most training adaptations that it sounds like the, you know, acclimation, especially from a heat perspective, sort of probably functions on a bell curve. Like doing nothing isn't good. And then staying in the sauna for 6 years probably isn't good either. I'm sure there's like, you know, you overstress yourself and then obviously has a detrimental effect.
Yeah, I think that's like training, right? It's probably a bit of that bell curve too, where there's an ideal and then there is a too much or too little. So yeah, there's definitely, and people fall on different places on that bell curve every single year, every single spring we see it. But yeah, I'm here to say you don't need to do that. You can do less is more sometimes.
Yeah. And I do think, you know, endurance athletes just hence what endurance is. And I'm sure as you push up the volume more to, ultra cycling, ultra running, Ironman triathlon, probably the personality types, I'm guessing oftentimes sort of fall in line with that more and more and more and more. And I'm sure it's harder to kind of, like, I remember talking to an ultra coach who said, my job isn't so much pushing my athletes, it's more keeping them back from, as you said, sort of doing
Always,
crazy things. That's really
always.
the hardest part. It's not motivating. It's not to say it's demotivating, but like, don't do that. You don't need to do that. So
Yeah, I could not agree more. It's like, hey, take a rest day. Hey, sit down.
yeah,
Hey, like the overdoing it constantly is, we have a lot of people like that in our sport, and that's okay. Like that is
yeah,
totally okay. But it's my uncle said something funny recently. He's like, yeah, everything is like okay in moderation, including moderation.
right.
But yeah, I'm, with my
That's
physiology hat
funny.
on and my practitioner hat on, it's like, okay, like let's figure out the right dose for you and then kind of work from there versus the like throw everything against the wall and hope something sticks.
Yeah, yeah, that makes complete sense. So you had mentioned it earlier, about humidity,
Mhm.
and what it's funny, moving to Colorado from the East Coast. I don't think I could ever move back there again. Humidity. We also went to Disney World in Orlando. I stepped off the plane. I'm like, oh my God, this
No,
this is
yeah.
terrible. I need to get back on and go back to Colorado. But for those people that either live in humid areas or are going to be racing in humid areas, let's say myself, who lives in a pretty dry climate, what are some strategies, if at all, to acclimate to humidity, or how best to deal with that?
Yeah, unfortunately, there isn't a lot of good research on if we can acclimate to humidity. It
Okay.
might be worthwhile, like we do know, for example, right? Like if we look at heat tolerance in a dry sauna versus a steam room, for example, you can't be in as hot of a steam room and tolerate it due
Okay.
to the humidity. And part of that is because when you sweat in that environment, you can't utilize evaporative cooling. Evaporative cooling only works when sweat on your skin gets to turn into a vapor and leave your skin and go into the environment. And that is like, we do something like 80% of our cooling naturally via evaporative cooling. And so it's not
Okay.
as effective in a humid environment. And that is why humidity sucks. Like no matter how you dice, how you cut it, how you dice it, that is why humidity sucks. That's why
Yeah.
racing out west is awesome, because you can splash water on yourself and that is effective at cooling. It does not work
Yeah.
as well in a humid environment. So I still think being heat acclimated to the best of your ability is really important. That's going to make the heat not feel quite as bad. It's going to allow you to sweat more efficiently. Your heart rate's going to be more normalized in that environment. You're going to have more thermal comfort, both from like a cellular level and from like a mental level. But that might mean, getting into a steam room periodically during that kind of build, just so that you're emotionally or mentally cognitively like,
Mm,
okay, I'm on board with what this feels like. Cause I think that is
yeah.
the thing. It's not so much that you can acclimate to it as you can be mentally prepared for it. And then your in race cooling strategies need to probably be adapted a little bit to be most effective, because things like, again, like evaporative cooling isn't going to be quite as effective, but you can still get ice on you. Ice out west does two things, right? It's ice on your skin, which is cooling, plus it melts, which is evaporative cooling. So it's like there's some like multiple things that you could use in that humid environment that still are effective, just not quite as effective as in a dry environment. But yeah, so you're mostly going to be doing the same thing. You're going to be looking for general heat acclimation, but there isn't like a good clear cut answer for like, this is going to help you adapt to a humid environment
Got it. Well,
over
that's a
just a
great
hot
point,
environment.
though. Okay, that's a great point you made, though, about the mental aspect, to know sort of what it might feel like, almost to get that comfortable being uncomfortable, so it doesn't come as a complete shock. I think that's such a great tip and a great rationale for using the like a wet sauna prior. That's
Yeah,
awesome.
I think that wall acclimation is real. I think that there's a big mental component to a lot of this, of just feeling like you're ready for the thing.
Yeah,
And so, placebos work as well. We do know that there
sure.
are like, there are biochemical underpinnings to what's going on here, right? There's hematological changes, et cetera, that are really important and help your physiology work to the best of its ability. But the mental side of it is still really, really important. And so oftentimes I know athletes of mine, like just getting into the sauna, like knowing that they've done their sauna time mentally makes them feel like they're ready for that hot event. And that is
Mm,
just immensely important.
yeah, for sure. Probably just as, if not more than, the actual physiology
Yeah,
part, I'm guessing,
it's
right?
probably pretty like, we'll never be able to say, oh, it's, 40% this and 60% that, but
Yeah.
we do know that mentally feeling like you're up to the task is really important.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting. You had mentioned, just being in good shape. I remember that's one of the things that Jason Koop stressed a lot, whether it be heat or altitude, is just, especially if you
Fitness.
can't get these things, just fitness, get as fit as you can, when you toe the line. And, yes, it might be better if you got some sauna time. Yes, it might be better if you got some, altitude time, but that will ensure that, you're giving yourself the best possible chance. So
Yeah. And so that is at play here too, right? You're adding a new stressor. And so you don't want, like, yes, being heat acclimated and having that sauna time is important, but it shouldn't come at the expense of your fitness. And that's why timing
mhm,
of it in the course of your training and what style you're using, I think, is so important, because you shouldn't stop doing workouts because you're overdressing. Right. Like you
right.
need to do workouts without being overdressed. And then if you have to use overdressing as your heat acclimation protocol, because that's what's available to you, because you don't live in an area with a sauna or a hot tub or you can't get your hot bath hot enough, etc. Like that's all you can do. You can't like not do the workouts that need to get done. You're gonna have to like figure out how to hedge a little bit so that you're getting some of that heat acclimation time to the best of your ability, but also making sure that you're still getting that long run in, you're still getting that workout in, because those things are still very, very important for race day.
Yeah, so it's sort of like finding and hitting that sweet spot, I guess, as much as possible
Yeah.
with all those things in consideration.
Yeah.
Um, so maybe we can next move on to altitude, and we can certainly come back to heat as well to discuss maybe some of the granular stuff. Kind of like what we talked about with heat. Are there any ways that someone should be acclimating to heat, to altitude in some ways that are not advised? And obviously, kind of like also what you said about heat, some people just don't have these things. Not everyone can arrive a month in advance to a race to acclimate, so on and so forth. And it was funny moving out here from New York City. We had my wife and I had a newborn at that time, and it was on the second floor of his house, which is of our house where his room was. And I would always sing this song to him at bedtime to help him go to sleep. And I would get through like two verses. I'd be like, like that's it. That's all the
Totally.
song you're getting. I was like, this is awful. And I'm only at like, I don't know, 5,500 feet or something. So fortunately now I can actually sing a little bit more than two verses without dying. So, it's definitely, acclimation is definitely a thing. But so maybe if you could talk about what are some maybe correct ways, some incorrect ways in ideal versus if you can't do ideal, what's the next best thing?
Yeah. So I think a caveat's kind of off the top, right? That if you can't get out to altitude because of life constraints, right? Like it's expensive. It's you work and you work, maybe you don't work remotely, you have a family. It's not you didn't get into hard rock and like it's like, okay, it's hard rock. I'm gonna take every possible opportunity because it's my one chance to do this race, etc. Like it is hard to make those sacrifices. And they're not sacrifices, they're choices, but like it's a privilege to get to make those choices, I guess is what I would
Sure.
say. So being as fit as possible, still very important. Other important caveat here is that it turns out your iron stores are really important. And so advising to athletes to, ahead of going to altitude, say you're going to an altitude camp, you're going to just go out and play in Colorado for 3 weeks and you've got a race 6 weeks away, or you're going to go to, you're getting ready for a big race, you're going to go out 2 weeks early or 3 weeks early, et cetera. Your body can't make hematologic adaptations. It can't create erythropoietin, essentially EPO. Your kidneys naturally produce it, which is awesome. Your body can't do that if it doesn't have enough ferritin stores, if it doesn't have enough iron stores, which is measured in your blood in a blood panel as ferritin.
Okay.
So I advise to athletes, say 6 weeks out, because it takes a little while to get in with your PCP and get the blood drawn, et cetera. If you're not going to go through a private company, et cetera, to get that done, you're going to want to get, along with your normal CBC, an iron panel and a ferritin reading, because a ferritin reading does not come in a standard iron panel,
Mm,
which a lot of people I think miss sometimes. It hasn't historically come as a standard part of the iron panel, which is going to give you hemoglobin, hematocrit, et cetera. But that ferritin number becomes important. And if your ferritin is not above, and I don't remember the units off the top of my head, it's very standard. It's always prescribed. It's always written the same way. I've heard as low as 20 milligrams for women and 30 for men. So I like to say 25 and like more like 30 to 35 as kind of that range. You want your ferritin to be above that. If your
okay.
ferritin is below that, you will not, you're like, it's very unlikely that you will adapt to altitude because your
Mm.
body doesn't have the iron stores to make those hematological adaptations. Your body doesn't have the iron stores to do the metabolic work to make EPO. And so what that means is that I don't want people to blindly supplement iron because iron at high levels is toxic. It deposits in your kidneys and your other organs. You don't want that. You don't want iron depositing in your organs. Men more so than women too, because men are less likely to have low iron levels. So getting that blood work done, seeing what that ferritin is, and then supplementing ahead of going to altitude and then while you're at altitude becomes really important, so that you can make adaptations once you get out there. Any sort of hypoxic environment ahead of that time, be it a hypoxic tent or room at your house, be it going to altitude early, none of that will work if you don't have ferritin.
Got it.
So that's a really important
Got it.
caveat. So
Yeah.
that is the baseline consideration for anything that comes after that.
Okay.
If you can't make it out to altitude early, they do say, hey, go the night before. That advice is actually pretty sound because what happens is that really it's like 36 to 72 hours. Really, so yeah, it's 36 to 72 hours after arrival at altitude that your body is kind of in the most ramped up state of trying to make adjustments to it.
Yeah.
And it does that by dehydrating you, to hemoconcentrate your blood, which is smart,
Okay.
right? It's keeping you alive. It's saying, oh my goodness, this is not great for us. It decreases your blood plasma volume. It hemoconcentrates your blood volume so that you can best use the red blood cells you have available to you. That doesn't make you feel very good though. That's important to note. It does not make you feel very good. So you can in fact go the night before, arrive at altitude, and for races that are less than 100 miles, that might be effective because you're not racing long enough to start to get into that zone where it's like, wow, hematologically, I'm not in a good place anymore. I can't speak to your GI system. I can't speak to other things that could go wrong in that race. But that is why that, arrive 2 weeks before or a day before becomes the kind of like slogan for the night before for a lot of racers who are trying to travel out to altitude. And that being said, like if athletes can arrive within that week before the race, I will tell athletes to arrive. If they can't arrive, 3 weeks before or 2 weeks before, but they can say make it out in that week before, I'll say, cool, just not like you need to be out there prior to that 3-day mark. Because once you get over that 72-hour window, you do start to feel better again. You're not like pumping out red blood cells, but generally by that point in time, your resting heart rate has started to normalize. Your hydration status has started to normalize. Your glycogen status has started to normalize. So like your fasted glucose upon waking up is more normal.
Okay.
So getting out there, say you can get out there 4, 5, 6, 7 days before, that is better than 48 hours before.
Okay.
And that's counterintuitive, but that truly is. It is truly better to get even just a couple days, but you want to get there before that 3-day mark because you don't want your race to be in that 48 to 72-hour window where you're going to feel your absolute worst.
Yeah.
So that's important. We've done studies with Randy Wilbur. He came out and did studies with us with the U.S. Biathlon team. We came out from Lake Placid, New York to Heber to Midway to the to be at Soldier Hollow every October, and he would show up every morning to do urine analysis, fasted glucose, and then we wore pulse oximeters and resting heart rate overnight. And on average, once we all got past that 3-day hump, you're in a much more normalized place. You can start to do intensity, et cetera, because your body is like kind of reached equilibrium. You're not going to have like started to produce massive quantities of red blood cells, which is why a lot of us go out to altitude to get that, that boost. But you're over that initial hump of like internal physiological turmoil. So night before or greater than 3 days before is kind of that the best possible scenario for the time crunched, for the unavailable to get out earlier from a travel standpoint. You can then do things to kind of get ready for that travel, right? You can, you can get into a hypoxic tent. You can, Hypoxico makes tents that go over your bed or just over your head even so that you don't have to disrupt your significant other if you share a bed with someone, which can simulate altitude. It is not as good as being at altitude, but it is effective. Once again, you have to have that baseline ferritin to start. And you have to weigh the cost benefit of some people sleep really poorly in them and having really horrible sleep quality that trade-off might not be worth it for you. So that's
Sure.
important to factor in. But yes, technically, like sleeping in that environment or spending, 10 hours or so. So you generally have to like extend your sleep window or at least spend some time pre or post bed in that environment to really
Okay.
get that adaptation. Um, and then the other piece of that puzzle would be, yeah, just weighing your sleep quality against it. You can also use a sauna protocol, a heat acclimation protocol to kind of
Yep.
prep for it as well. And that is again because we're looking at those hematological changes. So becoming heat acclimated increases your blood plasma volume, which is kind of what's happening when you go to altitude. So once again, it's not necessarily rapidly producing red blood cells, but it gets you prepped to be there.
Okay. Gotcha. So would you put I know that the heat I've been hearing about maybe for the last year or two, would that fall into the better than nothing category, would you say,
Yeah,
if there is such a category?
I would do that.
Okay.
I've used it. USA Cycling has used it with a lot of athletes. My husband raced for the US team for a decade, and used heat protocols to get prepared for races at altitude.
Hmm.
One caveat to that is that, and we're not 100% certain on all the mechanisms yet to a clear way, because this is based on some really old research that like we're doing in these like really kind of one-off studies, but not like a big cohort study yet. And that is being really methodical with with slowly rehydrating post sauna.
Oh, interesting.
So you got to go in with good kidney health. You got to go in without any major underlying health conditions, just because I think this can be like pretty like razor's edge type of thing. But essentially, you can do passive heating in a sauna post exercise. You keep your core body temperature elevated by taking a warm shower, which I'd recommend for anyone anyway, not a
Yep.
cold shower. And then you're just going to slowly rehydrate instead of like chugging water. You're going to slowly rehydrate. And what that does is that taxes the kidneys just a little bit more and can actually have them start to create EPO.
Interesting.
So having that EPO response from your kidneys is going to help build red blood cells. So it's kind of an exacerbated blood plasma expansion
Hmm.
scenario. And one of my friends did a really good research, a small but important research study at UBC with a number of track athletes. And we saw that we could increase their hemoglobin mass, which is, akin to having that EPO response, which is really, really cool.
Right. Interesting. That's really interesting. So go back to the altitude as far as the acclimation. Is there a specific altitude that you say, okay, well, yes, it's, you're at sea level in this, this race is at 5,000 feet. Don't worry about it. Or it has to be at a certain, 8,000 feet. Is there sort of any elevation that acclimation, as far as preparing is concerned, really sort of kicks in, or is it based on the individual?
I think people start to feel things around 5,000 feet, but generally speaking, we're talking in that 6 to 8,000 foot range is where
Okay.
it really becomes most apparent for most people. And that's also the range where if we're sending people to altitude, that's where we're telling them to go to. We don't want them to actually be like living necessarily or staying too much higher than that, because it actually can be like so high that you're not recovering well, et cetera. So that 6,000 to 8,000 foot range, I think, is where most people really start to notice altitude in a profound way. And then additionally, if you're going to altitude early for a race, you don't want to necessarily go live at 10,000 feet or 12,000 feet. That's like, once again, more is not better.
Yeah.
We found that from a recovery standpoint, living and doing at least some of your training, you can train lower than that and get benefits. It's kind of that live high, train low principle. Is that 6,000 to 8,000 foot range. And that's just like, it's enough of a stimulus without it like completely impairing your ability to recover.
Got it. So that was actually one of my next questions was, if there are any drawbacks about going to altitude. So it's really that going too high where, you might have more of a stimulus from the altitude, you're higher, but you can't do anything because you can't breathe.
Yeah, it's a major stressor. So like when we send people out to altitude, say they're going to go out 3 weeks early for a race, that first week out there, we'll actually have them like cut back their training volume like 10 to 20% and no
Okay.
intensity. If they're going to be up at that high elevation the entire time, they can go down lower. They can go, if they have the ability to drive down a little bit lower to 5,000 feet or lower to get in a speed workout, great. But it's enough of a stressor living and being that high that we're actually going to cut back training volume for a week. And then they can do 2 really good weeks of training.
Hmm.
And then maybe the race is the
That's right.
following week, or they're gonna do their final big week of training and then kind of have a taper week, et cetera. So that's kind of part of that calculus too, is that it's really hard to do intensity up there. And it's
Yep.
really hard to do too much training when you first get there, just because, once again, it's a huge stressor to the body. So you're going to need more carbohydrates than normal. You're going to need more protein than normal. You're going to need an iron supplement for the most part, unless you have hemochromatosis or you're a guy and you haven't gotten your blood work done in a while. But hopefully if you're going there, you've done blood work ahead of time. But supplementing iron while you're out there, et cetera, because it's really taxing. It's really, your body's trying to make adaptations. It's demanding. So you're going to drop you're going to drop your iron stores because of it. You're going to need to be really cognizant of being deficient in energy. So making sure you're eating enough, making sure you're getting enough carbs, enough protein, et cetera, like all becomes more important up there. And based on how high you are, like your sleep's impaired, so recovery goes
Yeah.
down a little bit. So it's a boon, but there's a bust there as well. So it's like very much trying to understand like how well you respond to being at a certain elevation.
Gotcha.
But again,
So
big mental win, huge mental win for athletes.
yeah, no, absolutely. So is there, let's say I have all the time in the world. I can do whatever I want. I'm a billionaire. I can
We
spend
love
weeks
this
and weeks at
scenario.
altitude.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. It's perfect. What would be, let's say I have a race at sea level, but I just want to get more, red blood cells, get
Mhm.
my EPO up. What would be the ideal amount of time at altitude? And then I guess conversely, how should I structure it so I still have those benefits back at sea level? So how long does that benefit of those, that work that I put at altitude last? If maybe that's the right way to phrase it.
Yeah. So we call that degradation of adaptation. And like for heat, for example, every 3 days without heat exposure is about a 2.5% loss of your adaptation.
Okay.
That's why, like, if you've done sauna, but you're not going to sauna right before a race that week because it's too stressful, you do what you like can get in a sauna once every 3 days and maintain that adaptation. I can't
Got
remember
it.
exactly what the time course is for degradation of loss at altitude, but for complete loss of adaptation, it's probably at, my guess is in the 2 to 3 week range.
Okay.
So what you'd want to do, it's probably, yeah, my guess is, I mean, it's red blood cell turnover, right? Is what you'd be looking at in that case. So it's got to be in that, like, can't be less than 14 days, probably more of the like 21 day plus range. There's probably an infographic out there that I just don't have at my fingertips right now. I'm like, oh, do I have a source for this that I can pull up? But what I would do is I'd spend 21 days out at altitude,
Okay.
maybe a little bit more, if you can. But what you'd want, like 21 days is kind of that minimum threshold for red blood cell, like getting all the benefits of red blood cell production. So what
Got
I
it.
would do is I'd go out, I'd have kind of a low week when I first get out there. Like I'd maybe train hard ahead of time, go out there, have a low week so that my body adapts and it's not too stressful, and then put in a 2 to 3 week training block.
Okay.
And then come home and have maybe 10 to 14 days between then and race day at lower elevation. I think that gives you a little
Okay.
bit of time to freshen up, a little bit of time to do some more high end speed potentially if you're training for a track race or a short fast race. Just get the body kind of turning over. We see that a lot with like our track and field athletes, kind of like looking at that time course between altitude exposure and being at an event. Maybe they've got to travel to Europe to be at an event that gives enough time to travel and to adapt, or they're doing all their I feel track athletes right now are hanging out in Switzerland doing their altitude block
Okay.
ahead of going to Budapest for Worlds. So
Oh, okay.
because they want to be on the right, they don't want to do the time jump and the altitude jump, or they're getting the altitude
Sure.
benefit and doing the time jump early. So those are kind of the things that we're looking at. But that's what I would do if I had all the flexibility in the world and I like was really like gearing up for a really big event.
Yep.
And I wanted to do an altitude block. That's what I would do. I would do 3 to 4 weeks at altitude, with the first week being really, really easy, like a recovery week, and then having a 2 to 3 week big training block, and then coming home and having kind of like a 10 to 14 day tune up period before race day.
Okay. No, that's great information. That's super. It's funny. There's a climb right out where I live here, sort of in the foothills of the Rockies, and it starts. I guess like I'm at like 5,500 feet. It goes up to like 8,500 feet. It's called a high grade climb. And aside from being out of shape, like you notice like with each pedal rev, as you're going up,
Yeah.
this sucks a little more. The only good thing is at the top of this climb, there's this little schoolhouse they're renovating, and they're raising money for it. So they put out bags of cookies and
I
Gatorade in
love
a
it.
cooler, and you can donate if you want. I'm like, okay, I'm not saying the cookies and the Gatorade make this climb worth it because you still suffer like a dog, but this is so much better.
Yeah.
so,
Yeah. I find in
so
like the
it's kind of
Colorado area,
genius.
whenever I'd come out there, it'd be like, I feel really good until 10,000 feet. And then I'd hit a wall at 10,000 feet. And then like
Yeah,
once I was up there and had a snack, then I could generally rebound. But it was like the
yeah,
initial wall every single time we like were doing a 14er or something. I'd feel great until 10K. And then I'd be like, oh, and then I'd shove
yeah.
a bunch of carbohydrates in my face. And then like an hour later, I'd be like, okay, I'm better again. But yeah,
Right.
it definitely hits you in the face at some point in time. It's just a matter of like hanging on until it feels a little bit better.
For sure. Yeah. Cookies at the top always make that easier, the hang
Yeah,
on
for
part. That's
sure.
for sure.
Gatorade too. It's this liquid sugar going in. I love it.
Yeah. It was whoever came up with this is a genius. I
Yeah,
loved it.
agreed.
um, so I know you had talked about this earlier. Maybe this is similar to the humidity, that you can't really acclimate it, but maybe the mental side. So let's talk about cold weather, about acclimating to cold weather. If you can, if it's not so much, and then maybe the mental aspect of just being out there in cold weather.
Yeah, so a lot of it's tolerance. It's there's a huge mental component to it. I actually wrote a piece for Iron Fire a while back about cold acclimation and how it's like not really feasible. There's a lot of research out there about brown adipose tissue
Okay.
and like shivering or non-shiver. So brown adipose tissue is a type of adipose or fat tissue in the body. We see a lot of it in people who work outside, divers. There's these women in I think it's Japan who dive for pearls, and they have a lot of this brown adipose tissue.
Oh,
And
interesting.
what it does is it does this thing called non-shivering thermogenesis, which basically allows you to create heat without
Hmm.
shivering, right? When we get cold, our core body temperature is going down. We do things like we vasoconstrict. So we shunt blood away from like our nose, our ears, our fingers, our toes towards the core because it says, hey, we got to protect our core. We got to keep our core warm. So our hypothalamus, I'm pretty sure, is making all that happen in our brain. It's the thermostat. So it first does that, right? It starts to vasoconstrict. It also makes us shiver. Shivering is basically micro contractions of our skeletal muscle fiber, which creates heat, which helps to keep us warm. Brown adipose tissue does this. And babies have a lot of brown adipose tissue too.
Hmm.
Interestingly, this is something that we don't maintain. But it does this thing, yeah, called non-shivering thermogenesis, which allows us to stay warm and keep, it's kind of like an internal heating jacket, which is really, really
Interesting.
cool. So more cold exposure could create more brown adipose tissue, which would allow you to stay warmer in cold environments. We don't think that things like cold plunging is really going to be enough of a stimulus to bring about the development of brown adipose tissue. So it's mostly people who are doing things like working outside, spending a lot of time outside. So we see it a lot. There are a bunch of studies done with like lumberjacks, essentially people that work
Hmm.
out or working outside in the cold. I would imagine people who work in certain warehouse industries where they're in cold rooms, because some of those warehouses, people who are working within warehouses, some of those warehouses are really, really cold. So I would actually be really
Hmm.
curious to see how much brown adipose tissue, if any, is being developed in workers in those environments.
Hmm.
But essentially what it's going to do though is it has a higher metabolic demand. And so what that specifically is going to do is going to increase like need for glycogen. Um, the the other way we adapt to the heat or adapt to cold is like by putting on an insulative layer. And that's what they saw in the divers specifically. So these divers in Korea and Japan free dive without wetsuits in cold water and can maintain their core body temperature in extreme environments. And they called this insulative acclimation. And so
Okay.
it's this weird acclimation over time, which it basically allowed a redistribution of the blood flow. So essentially it was a very specialized, enhanced form of vasoconstriction.
Hmm.
So it wouldn't create vasospasm or vasoconstriction where it would pull all the blood away from your fingers and toes, et cetera, and it would allow them to keep their extremities a little bit warmer while still maintaining core body temperature. But it's not something that we're going to see in like the running population. What we are going to
Right.
see though is like a lot of us who have had a lot of cold exposure. I was a Nordic skier, a figure skater. I don't have Raynaud's, but I do have like my hands, my fingers and toes have vasoconstricted intensely enough that like I get the screaming barfies every time I like go start a Nordic ski or go start a backcountry ski. And essentially like there's this vasoconstriction, and then as you start to move, generally moving your fingers and toes, you've got venous return going on. So blood only moves through your veins due to muscle contractions because it doesn't have valves that are pumping actively. Your muscles pump to move blood through your veins. That's why you get like fat feet when you travel, because you don't have you're not contracting your calves, so blood's not returning to your core. Same with like when I'm running and I'm not using poles, my fingers get fat. It's not due to hydration status. It's because I'm not pumping my hands and my forearm muscles to like have blood return to my core. So same thing goes on with like when you've been exposed to it over and over. It's kind of a maladaptation, maybe, so to speak. But if you've experienced the screaming barfies, you know exactly what I'm talking about because they're horrible. And there's a really funny emergency medicine paper on this. And it says, although there are limited reports of actual like vomiting, like, so they're like, why is it called the screaming barfies? And I'm like, I know why. It's because when you experience it, you feel like you're going to cry and vomit at the same time. But essentially it's this vasoconstriction in your digits, and then blood flow is returning to it. And so they're kind of being not forced through constriction, but essentially it's like a hypersensitivity, and it feels really horrible. And your hands get nice and warm and you're generally good for the rest of the day. But so that's probably maybe a maladaptation to the cold, but generally speaking, there's not a whole lot you can do. More time outside definitely helps in temperature below 50 degrees. But yeah, it's trying to increase brown adipose tissue, and that's just really hard to do.
Yeah.
You have to like expose yourself to a lot. It's possible cold showers and ice plunges help to a degree, but we think that it's really just like time in the cold over time that is really helpful.
Got it. So I'm sure you've heard of that. I think he's Dutch, that guy, Wim Hof.
Yeah, totally.
So is he sort of like sort of an outlier then? Do you think he just sort of naturally maybe has a lot more brown
It's
adipose
very
tissue? Or do you
possible.
think,
I think the people
okay,
that are like practicing like full practicing Wim Hof methodology, where they're doing like quite a lot of cold exposure, like pretty extreme ice bath scenarios where they're fully submerged. It's not like my ice bath is like sitting in a cold river up to my belly button. Like that is enough for me.
yeah,
That's not enough to develop cold, like the brown adipose tissue. So people that are doing kind of extreme like cold plunging, they are more likely. And so I think Wim Hof is kind of like an extreme example of someone in that environment.
okay, okay.
But I
Yeah,
imagine
because I know
if we did a scan, I bet he's a lot of brown adipose tissue.
yeah, because I remember, I mean, I don't know if he's still in the news a lot, but a few years ago, I feel like anytime you would anything about cold weather, like his name would pop up. He was sort
Yeah,
of like sucked all
totally.
the oxygen out of the room. He was like Wim Hof, Wim Hof, and like you said, he's got this sort of tribe of followers. So it's every time I think of cold exposure, that name just comes to mind.
Yes, that is definitely his domain, for sure. But yeah, so it's very likely that he is like an extreme adult version of like having a lot of brown adipose tissue. So yeah,
Yeah,
something you're interested in. That's what I would like have people look into is brown adipose tissue and
okay.
non-shivering thermogenesis. And there's some links to cold plunging, but I think you've got to be like really into it. And I'm just
Yeah,
not that into
yeah,
it. Turns out
yeah.
I do not like that kind of cold plunging. It does not make me happy and warm and fuzzy.
Yeah, no, for sure. I can't even do the cold shower. I just can't. I don't care. Even if
Yeah,
it did elicit performance, I just can't do it. I just don't like being miserable.
yeah, you like it would have to have some sort of like really, really outsized health benefit
Yeah,
for
for
me. And it's
sure.
just, there are enough other things that like increase dopamine and serotonin that does not involve a horrible cold exposure in my mind.
Right, 100%. I'm right there with you. So maybe we'll finish off today getting back to the heat conversation again. So are there specific protocols that athletes can follow when it goes to the sauna, whether it be, the dry sauna or the steam room? Are there specific protocols that you would recommend?
Yeah. And I think we should add too, because they're really popular right now, are the infrared saunas.
Hmm.
They're cheap. You can put them in your house. We don't actually, I think they probably feel nice, but we don't actually have any research into mechanistically if they work for heat acclimation. So
Oh, okay.
I just advise against them for that reason.
Yeah.
As far as like, hey, if you're looking to do heat acclimation, don't use a dry sauna if at all possible.
Okay.
So to do that, or a hot tub. So what you're gonna do, although it's not a luxurious hot tub, it's like you're in up to your neck the entire time. Don't
Okay.
get your shoulders out, don't get your arm out scenario, because your body's trying to thermoregulate. Yeah. So what I would recommend for athletes is that we know that 5 to 9 days or 5 to 7 days, we make most of our adaptation. At 10 days, we're pretty much have all the adaptation that we can get. It's not like more and more and more and more is better. And then we maintain that by having more exposure every third day. What you're going to find is Jason Koop, who I am fond of and has been one of my colleagues for a long time. He recommends 2 rounds of this, just because he likes to test it first. If you've never done a heat acclimation protocol, doing 1 round earlier in your training block, just to make sure that you like it and it feels good and you're not totally
Sure.
destroyed. Like, that's important. So I would recommend that you could try that. I would try it on a medium low week, not the first week of a new block, not a recovery week, kind of a medium week. So you're
Okay.
not as fresh as possible, but you're not trying to recover from something. And you're going to go in every day for 7 to 10 days, ideally. Post
Okay.
exercise, if you can, and why we say post exercise is because your core body temperature is already elevated. And so that's why you only have to go in for like 30 minutes, is because your core body temperature is already high. Like, yay, like you're just
Mhm.
adding to the stress.
Yeah.
If you can't do that, I'd recommend getting on a spin bike or whatever. I'd overdress in the gym. Like, so you're going to the gym to do this. So you can get the run in the morning, and then you've got another hour that you can use in the afternoon to get something in. Go to the gym, get on a spin bike in a sweatshirt and sweatpants or whatever. You don't need to like go crazy, but you're just trying to get your core body temperature up. You're trying to get a sweat going. Do that for
Okay.
20 to 30 minutes and then get into the sauna. Don't go in cold, essentially.
Okay.
So try to get yourself warmed up a little bit ahead of time. Because that's where that adaptation comes from. It's building off of you already being warm. From there, what we want to do is, again, 7 to 10 days in a row.
Okay.
Coop's recommendation, which is slightly different than mine, is that to then do the second round basically in the final 10 days before your race. I
Okay.
personally don't love that, because in my mind, it leads all the way up to race day. It's a big stressor. So what I recommend athletes do is I actually look a couple weeks out from the race,
Okay.
and I have them do a 10-day block, 30 minutes, dry sauna, 10 days in a row. And then every third day until like Tuesday or Wednesday of race week, they're getting in the sauna again.
Okay.
They're extending that thing. And maybe they get 2 days in a row here, 2 days in a row there, but really it's just the every third day to maintain the adaptation. And it takes some of the stress away from race week. Because I personally think that that's just a little too much during race week. And we know that you can extend out that adaptation just fine with that every third day protocol.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Gotcha. That makes sense. So with the sauna, with the dry sauna, is there a specific temperature that it should be at, or a range? I know sometimes, I'm guessing, I don't know how gyms do it, if they have a specific protocol they have to use, but is there a set temperature range that elicits the best adaptation?
Yeah, I'm looking for over 180 degrees if possible.
Okay.
So a lot of the literature says 70 to 90 degrees Celsius. We'll say 180 to 100 or to 200 degrees Fahrenheit for a dry sauna. A lot of the gyms are going to be in that kind of 180 to 190 degree range.
Okay.
You really don't want something that's like below 145. Below
Okay.
145 is like not hot enough. Less than 15 minutes, not really long enough. It's kind of like the low dose end.
Got it.
You want
Got
you
it.
want more than that. And then for a hot tub, because hot tubs are effective, and you might have a hot tub but not a sauna. You want about 104 degrees, or I think
Okay.
the Celsius recommendation is like 40 degrees Celsius. What you're going to do is, I think most hot tubs are like kind of like ranged out at 104. But in that hot tub, you're not hanging out like you're a frat boy with your arms out on the sides. Like you are
Drinking
in
the
up to
beer.
your neck in it. It's going to get uncomfortable. You're going to want to pull an arm out to thermoregulate. That's what your body's doing. Your body's saying, hey, we're too hot. Take an arm out. Cool off a little bit. Don't do that. You got to stay up to your neck. You really want, like, it's because your core body temperature is creeping up, and that's why it's saying, hey, you got to get out. So listen to your body. Don't pass out, please. I like that. We have to make the recommendation. Do not pass out. Do not do anything to hurt yourself, or medically otherwise. That's our unofficial legal jargon we're going to throw in. But yeah, so that's the hot tub there. Is like most hot tubs at 104 degrees, staying fully submerged is going to be kind of your best bet there.
Okay. Okay. Awesome. So, I know we didn't sort of schedule this topic, but since you had mentioned at the beginning, maybe maybe just briefly touch on the pollution aspect. One of the things out here, and I know it's obviously a thing in a lot of parts of the country, is, wildfires for a long time. I know it's been a thing this year, last year for us out here in Colorado. I mean, during the summer, there must have been probably a total of, I don't know, 3 weeks, 4 weeks where you couldn't really be outside doing anything. It smelled bad. You couldn't see the mountains. And,
yeah,
I mean, it was pretty terrible. So any specific recommendations to do or not to do as far as, air pollution is concerned, whether it be smoke or whatnot?
Yeah, so you want to listen to those general kind of health recommendations as far as kind of like that green, yellow, orange, red, purple scale. I would say a lot of that has to do with your personal health. Do you have asthma, etc.? Do you have a hypersensitivity? Those things are important to listen to, because you're going to be more sensitive. But generally speaking, it's not worth it to exercise in poor AQI. You can go to a gym. You can wear a tight fitting N95 mask. A surgical mask is not going to protect you from poor air quality. That is not the particulate matter is too small. That will not work. And I would also say too, if it's a one-off day, don't exercise. That's okay.
Yeah.
Ride and otherwise, like, we bought air filters for our house, right? So like, if we have bad AQI for a stretch, I've got a bike trainer. I can set up my bike trainer. I can put the air purifier in that room. I can create a safe room for me to exercise in.
Yeah.
You don't want to be doing that outside. Generally speaking, you can run in moderate air quality, but you want to cut down duration and you want to cut down intensity.
Got it.
So you don't want to be doing high volume, super intense work because you're just ventilating harder or for longer in there. And so it's like, it's kind of, it's I would say it's fairly common sense. And my big thing too is like extreme cold, air pollution, they are irritants to your lungs. And it's just like, at what cost am I doing this now?
Yeah. 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 Probably best to err on the side of caution in those areas. Got it. Awesome. Well, I feel like that sort of sums up, I feel like, a lot of the things that I certainly want to chat about. Was there anything else that you feel kind of that would be super important for endurance athletes, or I guess any athletes, or just humans in general, to know about, the environment as far as how to train in it most effectively?
Yeah. I mean, I think that while we, speak against, N of one stuff, like, you are an N of one, like, I think it's really important to practice this, to try it. You're putting a lot of time and energy into training for your race, logging the hours, etc. Don't throw it away by being ill prepared for the environment you're going to run in. Like, prepare for the heat, prepare for the altitude, prepare your gut, prepare all these little things, because it's like, you can throw your race away on something pretty little.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So kind of treat the environmental physiology aspect the same as you would with new shoes. Trial it in training.
Don't try anything new on race day.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I think, people know that about, like, shoes and, equipment and all that kind of stuff. But I'm guessing a lot of that might go out the window when it comes to this stuff. They're like, oh, I read this has got to work, so I'm just going to do it. And all of a sudden they get to altitude and the wheels come off or whatever happens.
And your best, for example, your best acclimation, your best in heat or in race, your best in race cooling strategy is pre-race heat acclimation.
Got it.
So like, you can do all you want during the race for cooling. It doesn't mean as much if you haven't gone in with heat acclimation on board already.
Right. Makes complete sense. Makes complete sense. Well, this is awesome. I feel like this is, of all the podcasts we've done, I feel like this has provided so much really, useful, actionable content for the listeners. So thank you so much. Corinne, is there a place where our listeners can check out some of the articles you've written or are still writing, or any websites or anything like that?
Yeah, so I've written a bunch of science heavy stuff over at I Run Far. It's the
Okay.
Running on Science column that I've
Okay.
penned. So there's like 5 years worth of
Oh,
monthly
wow.
science there for people to
It's
dive into
amazing.
on a super wide range of topics. So I would say like
Okay.
go check those out. Like, and I did a bunch of like myth busting ones there too, which are super fun, like
Oh,
little like
nice.
fact or fiction pieces. So I'd recommend like scrolling through that stuff. They can probably find a lot of really useful and likely, I would say for the most part, very up to date, or like still relevant, still up to date content, even if I wrote it in 2018 or 2019.
Okay. Awesome. Perfect. Sounds good. Well, thank you so much for your time today. This has been great.
Yeah, I'm super excited to get to share a little bit more about what I love so much.
Definitely, for sure. Well, thank you so much for your time. And hopefully we
Awesome.
can have you again on the podcast again soon.
Yeah, sounds great.
All right. Thank you, Corinne.